The first thing the medics noticed was the blood. It had spread wide beneath her, dark and thick against the frozen ground, turning the trampled snow into something that looked less like earth and more like a wound the land itself had taken. The second thing they noticed was that she was still talking. Not screaming, not crying, talking. Her voice came out low and controlled, the voice of someone who has decided somewhere below conscious thought that the thing happening to her body is not the most urgent thing happening right now. Her left hand pressed against her own chest, fingers curled inward, holding pressure the way you hold something you cannot afford to drop. Her right hand held the radio against her jaw. Her eyes were open, fixed on the gray November sky, not seeing it, tracking something only she could see, with some internal map, some grid of priorities in which her own survival appeared somewhere below several other items. "Groff," she said, "move your team 15 meters north. There's a stone wall. Use it." Static. Then a voice rough with something that was not quite disbelief and not quite anything else. "Doc, you need to. 15 meters north, Master Chief, the wall now." The sound of boots on frozen ground. Commander Bull Merritt was already beside her. He had dropped to one knee the moment she went down and had not moved since. His hands covered hers, adding pressure, and his face a face that had spent 51 years absorbing things, wind and shrapnel, and the specific kind of news that arrives in the middle of the night was doing something it almost never did. It was doing nothing at all. Not the blankness of a man without feeling, but the controlled stillness of a man containing something he has not given himself permission to name. He said her name. Once. She turned her head and looked at him. And she smiled. Not a grimace, not the reflex that pain sometimes forces onto a face. A real smile, small and certain, the expression of someone who has gotten to where they were trying to go, even if the path cost more than anticipated. The medics came in hard from the east 30 seconds later, bags already open. The first one to reach her, a young specialist with mud on both knees, stopped for half a beat when he saw her face, because she was still smiling. He got to work, but the image stayed with him for a long time after. 72 hours earlier, Tessa Cole was a name on a manifest. P.O.2 Cole T, Navy Corpsman, and assigned to SEAL Team 3 operational support. Medical qualification, level 4. No prior deployments listed as primary MOS, cleared for forward operations. On paper, she was a medic. On paper, she was nothing beyond that. The base was not much of a base. 8 modified shipping containers arranged in a rough rectangle at roughly 1,200 meters elevation in the Apuseni Mountains of western Romania, painted the color of mud, because mud was what surrounded them on 3 sides. A helicopter pad of compacted gravel, a communications antenna leaning 4 degrees northeast, apparently unconcerned. Generator noise running beneath everything like a second heartbeat, steadier than the first. November had arrived in the mountains the way it always did in that part of the world, without notice and without mercy. The temperature that morning was -7 Celsius. The sky held the dense gray of a system that had made up its mind. Trees stood bare and dark against the ridgeline, each branch holding small arrangements of ice that caught no light because there was no light to catch. Inside the largest container, which served as briefing room, operations center, and dining area depending on the hour, 6 people stood or sat around a map-covered table. A space heater in the corner worked at full capacity. Its best effort was losing. Tessa Cole sat at the far end. She had arrived on the same helicopter as Agent Farrow, the CIA case officer coordinating the mission. Farrow was 44, slim, with the kind of careful face trained to give away nothing, and practiced enough that it had become constitutive rather than performed. He wore civilian clothes, clean ones, which already distinguished him from everyone else in the room. He had shaken hands with Commander Merritt with the ease of someone accustomed to being the most important person present. Tessa had set her bag against the wall, checked the latch, and said nothing. Commander Merritt stood at the head of the table. The name Bull had come from somewhere in his early 20s under circumstances he had never fully explained, and by now it had replaced the name given at birth so completely that official documents sometimes seemed to be describing someone else. He was 51 years old and built like a question nobody wanted to argue with, broad through the chest, thick through the hands, with a quality of stillness that was not the absence of energy but its absolute management. 30 years in the water and mud and dark had taught him that wasted movement was wasted life. He had read every file in the room twice. He looked at each person before he spoke. Aleksandar Dravic, he said, 63 years old, former senior officer, Serbian State Security Service, 17 years of operational experience. He walked into the U.S. consulate in Vienna 6 weeks ago and said he had something we needed. Farrow touched a key on his laptop. A photograph appeared on the wall screen, A heavy-set man with white hair and a gray beard photographed at distance outside what looked like a butcher shop. Dravik spent years building files. Farrow continued, taking the briefing as naturally as water finding downhill. Documents, financial records, communications, evidence of a network operating inside U.S. intelligence, people selling access, selling information. He claims 47 names. He wants witness protection for himself and his family in exchange for everything. What's the format? This from Master Chief Groff, who stood near the door with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has heard many things described as uncomplicated and has learned not to believe that word. USB drive, encrypted, physical. He won't transmit electronically. Given what he's describing, that's not an unreasonable call. And his location, a village called Bratesht. Mountain community population under 200, approximately 12 kilometers northeast on foot. He won't move. He's been there 6 weeks and trusts the locals, and he does not like vehicles on mountain roads in November. Which means we go to him. Merritt let the silence sit, then he moved to the topographic map on the wall. 12 kilometers of mixed terrain, forest rock, some open ground near the approach. We move at first light, make contact, secure the drive, and extract Dravik to a secondary location where the retrieval team takes over. 18-hour window before the weather closes the helicopter corridor. He looked around the table. There is a complication. Nobody looked surprised. Signals intelligence picked up armed movement in the area 3 days ago. Unknown affiliation. They may want Dravik for the same reasons we do. This is a timed operation. We move together. We move fast. His eyes settled on Tessa at the far end. Our medical support is Petty Officer Second Class Cole, Navy Corpsman. She goes with us. He said it without inflection, a statement of fact, but the silence that followed had a texture. Not hostility, something more professional than hostility. The skepticism of people who assess risk for a living and have drawn a preliminary conclusion. Not about her personally, about the category she appeared to represent, small female medic, 12 kilometers of frozen mountain ahead. Groff looked at a point on the wall 6 inches above her head. Tessa looked at the map. Groff found her at the equipment locker 40 minutes after the briefing. She was going through her medical bag with the focused precision of someone who has done this check many times and does not rely on previous checks to stand in for the current one. Tourniquet position, hemostatic gauze sealed and dated, chest seals 2, decompression needle capped, IV kit, medications in their labeled pouches. She touched each item in sequence and moved on. He leaned against the wall. You do a lot of field work. His voice was conversational in the way that keeps opinions present, but out of reach. Some, she said without looking up, combat deployments, forward support. That's not the same thing. She looked up at him, brown eyes level, not defensive measured. I've been where I was needed, she said. He studied her, 5'4", 122 pounds in cold weather gear that looked borrowed from a larger person. Her hands returning to the bag were precise and capable. Not remarkable to look at, just precise. Tomorrow's 12 kilometers in bad conditions, he said. Rough ground, cold. If you have any difficulty keeping pace, I won't have difficulty. I'm just saying that if the situation requires Master Chief, she sealed the bag and looked at him directly. I appreciate the concern. I won't have difficulty. He studied her for another second. Then he pushed off the wall and walked away. But his mind filed one item, the way her hands had moved through the kit. Not the speed, the order. The specific sequence of priorities embedded in the sequence of items. That sequence was not taught in a corpsman's basic curriculum. He did not act on this observation. He was not yet certain what it was evidence of. The second exchange happened at dinner, which in a forward operating context means something heated and edible, consumed standing or on a hard surface, while your attention is mostly elsewhere. Callum Briggs, the youngest of the group at 26 and built with the restless energy of someone who had not yet learned that energy has a weight limit, was talking about load distribution, specifically the medical kit and whether distributing some of its heavier components across the team made more tactical sense. Doc's what, 120 pounds? He said it to no one in particular, which was the way of saying it to everyone. Some of that kit weighs 30. That's 25% of her body weight across 12 kilometers of mountain. That slows the formation. Chief Hutchins Hatch, to everyone who had known him longer than a week, which was everyone, was eating and reading a topographic printout and doing what Hatch always did, absorbing everything without reacting to any of it. Tessa set down her coffee. The kit stays with me, she said. Briggs had the expression of a young man being helpful in ways he has not thought through. It's purely a weight management consideration. Practically speaking, Practically speaking, the kit has to be in one location. If it's distributed and I need something in the first 60 seconds of a trauma situation, those are 60 seconds I don't have. The kit stays with me. A pause. Besides, she said, picking up her coffee again, I've carried heavier. Nobody asked what she meant. Hatch looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required, then returned to his map. Groff made one more comment that evening, not to her but in a space small enough that it was not truly private. Hope she can keep her hands steady when it counts. He meant it technically, without malice. The professional assessment of a man who has spent 25 years in environments where doubt kills and who processes risk as information rather than insult. Tessa was behind him at a secondary equipment locker. She did not turn around. She did not respond. She set the observation in the category where she put most things that required no immediate action, noted stored to be addressed through performance rather than argument. Performance was the only answer to doubt that did not expire. The temperature dropped to -9 that night. Tessa lay in the narrow bunk in the smallest container, back against the corrugated metal wall, losing its argument with the cold, and ran through the operation. Her father had called it the walkthrough. You close your eyes and walk every step, every contingency. What if the path is blocked? What if the contact is compromised? What if the weather changes? What if someone goes down? Not to predict the future, to prepare the mind, so that when something unexpected arrives, some part of you has already been there, already has a foot in the door of that particular unknown. She had been doing the walkthrough since she was 9 years old. Raymond Cole had started teaching it to her the same year he started teaching her everything else. She could still recall the first time sitting on the tailgate of his pickup truck at the range in North Carolina, Pine and Gun Oil, and his canvas jacket, his patient voice explaining that preparation was not fear and not pessimism. It was respect. Respect for how fast things change. Respect for the gap between what you plan and what actually happens. She pressed her palm flat against the cold metal wall. She ran through the walkthrough one more time. Then she got up 2 hours before dawn and began preparing her kit. First light came slow and gray, the way it comes in the mountains in November, reluctant as if the sky is not fully committed to the idea of morning. The team assembled at the equipment point at 5:55. Merritt was already there, which was always the case. He had a quality of pre-existence in operational settings, as though he had arrived before the decision to be anywhere had been made. He ran a final equipment check without ceremony, moved to the tree line, and started walking. The team followed in the way teams follow when they have done this enough times to stop needing instructions. Tessa fell into the middle of the formation. She had asked Merritt the evening before where he wanted her. He'd said the middle. She hadn't asked why. The middle made tactical sense, reaction time from the front, fast-forward movement if needed. She had already known this. She asked because she wanted him to understand that she was thinking about it. The forest closed around them immediately. Dense, dark, quiet, except for boots on frozen ground and the occasional distant movement in branches overhead. The cold came from every direction, simultaneously radiating up through the earth as much as descending from the sky. Each exhale turned to steam and dissolved before the next step. She walked. She had walked in colder. She had walked farther. She kept those facts to herself, as she kept most facts about herself, and focused instead on the ground ahead, the formation's spacing and the quality of the silence around her. Silence tells you things if you know how to listen. The first 3 kilometers were clean. The 4th kilometer was where Briggs started favoring his left side. Not a limp. Nothing that would announce itself. A subtle adjustment in stride, a reduction in push-off from the right foot, a compensation that was compounding with distance in a way that said this was not fatigue. Tessa noted it at first sign and said nothing. She watched it through the next 200 meters. Consistent. Worsening at a rate consistent with joint irritation rather than muscle fatigue. She moved up beside him. "How's the right knee?" she said quietly. He looked at her sideways. "Fine." "When did it start?" "A beat. Maybe a kilometer back." "Rate it." "3. You're walking a 6, maybe 7. You've been compensating for 4 minutes. That kind of gait compensation over 8 more kilometers at this grade, you're looking at MC, L strain at minimum. Could be worse depending on anatomy." He didn't answer. "Next rest point," she said. "I look at it." Not a suggestion. He gave a short nod. At the natural depression, Merritt had identified on the topo map as a covered position. Tessa moved Briggs to a fallen log and had him extend the leg. She ran both hands along the joint through the fabric, systematic reading structure, the way you read through obstacles when instruments aren't available. 90 seconds. Medial meniscus, she said. Anterior horn. You've had this before. Briggs stared at her. Partial tear 3 years ago. It's irritated, not torn acutely, but there's swelling building in the joint capsule. If you keep the compensatory gait, you'll offload onto the lateral structures and have a real problem by kilometer 9. She was already pulling a compression wrap in thermal pack from the front pocket. This takes 4 minutes. Don't argue about the 4 minutes. He didn't argue. She wrapped the joint, not immobilizing, not restrictive, just the structural support that a compromised structure needs when it's being asked to perform. The wrap that reminds the body where its own limits are. Walk on it, she said. He stood. 3 steps. The compensatory pattern corrected immediately. Huh, he said. From across the depression, Hatch watched without expression. He took a drink from his water and said nothing. But he was watching her now with a quality of attention he had not brought to the morning's beginning. The formation moved out 4 minutes and 15 seconds after the stop. There are small gestures that tell you who a person is. Not the large ones, those are what people perform when they know they are being watched. The small ones happen automatically without decision and carry the real information. Hatch saw the first at kilometer 7. Tessa raised her binoculars to check the high ground on the northern ridge. Standard visual discipline. Every team member did it. But when she settled the binoculars against her eyes, the index finger of her right hand moved. Just once. A small involuntary curl reaching for something that wasn't there. A trigger. On a weapon she wasn't carrying. She lowered the binoculars. Her hands went still. She moved forward with the team, and the moment was over before it had fully begun. Muscle memory doesn't ask permission. It speaks on its own when the right stimulus arrives, and it speaks in the language of the thing that wrote it. The second gesture came at the second rest stop. She set her medical bag down. Not in the center of the clearing, where a medic would place it for immediate access. She set it against the base of a tree at the 3 o'clock position of the clearing's perimeter, the position that gave a clean sight line to the most likely southern approach, and from which a person could be standing with cover at their back in under a second. Tactical placement. Automatic. She went directly to check Briggs's knee without any awareness that she had done anything notable. The bag sat where she'd put it. She was already somewhere else in her attention. Hatch stored this, the whole of it without summary or editorial, the way a careful man keeps evidence before he knows precisely what it is evidence of. The third signal was the most telling. At kilometer 9, Merritt identified an anomaly, a small outbuilding not on the map partially collapsed, hidden from satellite imagery by canopy. He stopped the formation to evaluate it with his optics. While the entire team looked northeast at the anomaly, Tessa turned 45 degrees to the northwest, away from what everyone was watching, toward the unobserved direction. She had not been told to do this. No one had given the order. She had simply identified the coverage gap and filled it the way experienced operators fill holes in a perimeter without being shown where the holes are. She stood scanning the northwest for 37 seconds until Merritt completed his assessment and the team moved forward. Then she turned and walked, and the formation closed around her, and nothing was said. Hatch adjusted his spacing in the formation so that he was 2 meters behind her right shoulder instead of her left, and he paid attention. The village of Brateste appeared first as smoke. 2 thin columns rising behind the tree line, gray-white against gray sky, the smoke of wood stoves lit before dawn by people who have been in the same place long enough to have morning rhythms. It had the quality of permanence. Merritt held the team at the tree line and glassed the village for 4 minutes. 12 structures, stone construction most of them, a small church with an onion dome patched with corrugated metal, a track that was approximately a road, 2 vehicles visible, 3 people in the open doing the things that people do in mountain villages in November when nothing threatening is happening. No sign of the armed movement flagged by signals intelligence, which was either reassuring or the opposite, and experienced operators know which interpretation to apply by default. Merritt moved the team into a covered position behind a rock outcropping with observation on the southern approach, and ran a brief, quiet briefing. Drevik is in the last structure on the eastern end. Stone building, blue shutters on the second floor. We approach from the south. Briggs and Hatch hold here and maintain observation. Cole and I make contact. Groff looked up. I should be on the contact element. You're on overwatch from the north ridge, Merritt said without inflection. Cole goes in with me because Dravik won't open his door to someone who doesn't speak his language. And Cole speaks Serbian. A pause. This was news to most of the team. Beograd dialect, she said quietly, and some Torlakian. His village is in the south, so he'll default to Torlakian if he's uncomfortable. Nobody said anything. Groff moved to the overwatch position without further comment. The man at the village's edge was perhaps 70, wearing a coat that had been repaired many times and was better for it. He was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and watching the tree line with the practiced incuriosity of someone who has lived his whole life in a place where strangers sometimes appear from the forest and has learned that how you respond in the first 5 seconds tells them everything about whether you are useful to them. Tessa walked toward him directly. She spoke in Serbian. Not the Serbian of textbooks and language labs, the Serbian of a kitchen table of a particular region's particular rhythm, of someone who learned it the way you learn a language when the person teaching you grew up speaking it. The old man's eyes shifted. He responded. They went back and forth for perhaps 40 words on each side, and at the end of it he took his cigarette from his mouth and squinted toward the eastern end of the village and said something conclusive. She turned to Merritt. Dravik is in the house with the blue shutters. But there are two men the old man doesn't recognize who arrived this morning in an old Lada. They went into the guest house on the western end and haven't come out. Merritt absorbed this without visible change. Ages, she relayed the question, listened. Younger, both. He says they walked like military. Did he point them toward Dravik? She asked. Listened. He told them there was no room at the guest house and they should try Sanaya. The corners of her mouth moved slightly. Smart man, Merritt said. Very, she said. They moved east. The house with the blue shutters sat at the end of a narrow alley between two larger stone buildings barely wide enough for two people abreast. The shutters were closed, a thin line of smoke from the chimney. The door was heavy old wood with a steel latch added later the addition of someone who had decided at some specific point that the original arrangement was insufficient. Merritt knocked twice. Paused. 3 times. Silence. Then the sound of something being moved. Then the door opened 4 inches, held by a chain, and a face appeared in the gap. Old white-bearded with pale eyes that took in the 2 figures outside with the systematic assessment of someone who has spent a career in intelligence and has not retired from its habits. He spoke in Serbian. Tessa answered. She spoke for 20 seconds, unhurried. At one point, she moved her hand a gesture that was part of the sentence rather than separate from it. The man in the doorway listened to all of it without interruption, the sign of someone who has learned to wait for complete information before responding, which is to say someone who has been in intelligence work long enough for the discipline to become constitutive. When she finished, the pale eyes moved from her to Merritt, back to her. The chain came off. The door opened. Alexander Dravik was 63 years old and looked like a man who had stopped sleeping several weeks ago and was managing the deficit on willpower and coffee, neither of which was adequate over the long term. Heavy set in the way of a man who has been sedentary long enough that his mass has redistributed, not soft but settled, the posture of someone waiting out a specific period with as much patience as the circumstances allow. His hands were large and very still in the way of a man who has learned to manage what they want to do versus what is advisable for them to do. He led them to a table. He sat. He looked at Tessa. He spoke. She translated. He says he's been waiting 6 weeks. He says the 2 men this morning are not the first. Others came 2 weeks ago. He recognized them as former colleagues from state security. Not here for a reunion. Merritt nodded. Ask if he has the drive, she asked. Dravik reached into his coat slowly with the deliberate care of someone who understands how trained men react to unexpected hand movements and produced a USB drive. Small, unremarkable, worn at the edges from handling. He held it flat on his palm and looked at it for a moment the way you look at something that has cost you a great deal to carry. Then he looked at Tessa and spoke. Slowly, with weight behind each word. He says, she translated, and she paused before continuing, that the names on this drive include people with the power to make things disappear. Evidence, files, people. He says the reason he is trusting us with this today is that he has seen what happens when trust is misplaced, and he has decided the risk of giving this to the wrong people is smaller than the risk of holding it any longer. She paused. He wants to know one thing before he hands it over. What? Merritt asked. She listened. He wants to know if the people he's handing it to are the kind of people who understand that documents are one thing and the man who assembled them is another. Merritt looked at Dravik across the table. Then, without routing through Tessa, tell him yes. She did. Dravik considered this. Then he placed the drive on the table and slid it across to her side. She picked it up and slid it into the interior pocket of her jacket against her ribs, under 2 layers of insulated fabric. Secure. Drubik watched this and appeared to find it satisfactory. Then he stood and spoke briskly. "He says we should move," Tessa said. "He says the men at the guest house are going to run out of patience before we run out of daylight." Merritt was already on the radio. The alley was 12 feet wide and 40 meters long, running north to south the village's eastern perimeter wall at the far end. They moved single-file Merritt at the front, then Tessa, then Dravik, moving at the pace of a man who has been told to move quickly and whose body has its own opinions about that, and Rodriguez bringing up the rear. In her earpiece, Groff's voice from the North Ridge terrain clear. No movement observed, 2 figures still stationary in the western guest house. 40 meters, 30, 20. Merritt reached the end of the alley and stopped back flat against the eastern wall. He pressed himself to the stone and leaned just slightly, reading the open ground beyond. The sun had been behind clouds all day. Clouds move. They shift in ways that are not predictable and not polite. And when they open, they let through sudden columns of light that fall on things that were previously in shadow, on glass, on metal, on curved optical surfaces, and give those surfaces for a fraction of a second a brightness that does not belong to them. Tessa saw it. On the roofline of a building to the west, not the guest house, a different building, taller, better positioned, a point of light. Small, directional, present for less than half a second. Glass. Curved glass, the kind that belongs to a precision optical instrument. A scope. Her mind ran the geometry in the time between heartbeats. Angle of reflection, distance, direction. Merritt was about to step out from the corner of the alley. The gap between where he was and where he would be when he cleared the wall was 2 steps. She had one. She heard Groff's voice in the earpiece, the first syllable of a word, the beginning of a warning, and she did not wait for the rest of it. She moved, not behind Merritt, alongside him, into the exposed space he was about to occupy. The shot came half a second later. It hit above her left chest, below the clavicle, above the apex of the lung. The force of it spun her left, and she went down against the stone wall. Left shoulder dropping first, and she caught herself on her right palm on the frozen ground before she went all the way. The radio was still in her right hand. She pressed transmit. "Groff!" Her voice came out even, controlled. A small, extraordinary thing achieved through years of deliberate practice. "West roofline. Move your team to the north wall. 15 meters. There's cover." She felt Merritt beside her, felt the sounds of a trained operator processing and deciding in rapid sequence. And then his hands came over hers, over the place in her chest that was communicating urgently that something had gone wrong there. She did not look at the wound. She knew what was there. She had read wounds like this on other people, and knew the variables, knew that the most important thing in this moment was not her wound. The most important thing was the radio in her hand and the team on the other end of it. 15 meters north, she said again. The wall. The pain was significant. She noted it with the precision of someone who has learned to categorize pain rather than simply experience it, and she set it aside in the section of her attention reserved for things that needed handling shortly rather than now. Merritt's face was directly above her. He was applying pressure with both hands, and his face had gone to its absolute stillness. Not blankness, but the controlled containment of a man in whom something has bypassed the professional layer and reached something older underneath. He said her name, just once. She looked up at him, and she realized with the clarity that arrives when the noise of ordinary thinking is removed by circumstance that she was not afraid. She had walked through a version of this moment. Not this exact configuration. The walkthrough is never precise, but something with its essential shape. She had walked through the version where she had to make a decision about what was worth stepping into the open for, and she had known when she made it that it might look exactly like this. The drive was in the pocket against her ribs. The team was moving. Merritt was still here. Everything that needed to be preserved was still intact. She felt something she recognized after a moment as satisfaction. Not happiness. Satisfaction, the quiet thing that arrives when the outcome aligns with the decision, even when the decision was expensive. She looked up at him, and she smiled. The medics came in from the east 30 seconds later, moving at the pace of professionals who have learned to manage their own adrenaline, because adrenaline is not compatible with fine motor tasks. The first one reached her, and his hands were already moving, ready translating what he saw into clinical sequence. He stopped for half a beat, because she was still smiling. He had been a military medic for 6 years. He had reached a great many people who had been shot. He had not seen this before. He recovered, that is what professionals do, and got to work. Tessa let him. She released Merritt's hands. She let her own fall to her sides. She had done her part. This was his part now. She turned her head and looked at the sky. The clouds had closed again over the brief gap that had let through the light that had caught the glass on the roofline. Gray and complete. More snow coming. She heard Groff in her earpiece, calm professional, running the perimeter with the efficiency she had expected from him from the first moment she'd read his file. He was doing his job. She had bought the team 30 seconds of positional advantage, and those 30 seconds had been enough. She closed her eyes. Groff reached her position 10 minutes later after the site was secured, and the immediate threat, neutralized by his overwatch fire, and the two men from the guest house had made the correctly calibrated decision to put a running vehicle between themselves and a SEAL element rather than contest the engagement. He stood over her while the medics worked. She was still, eyes closed, letting it happen with the patience of someone who understands how long these things take and is not fighting the timeline. He thought about the last 36 hours, the equipment locker, the comment about steady hands, the walk, the knee assessment, the northwest coverage she had taken up without being asked. He stood there another moment. Then he turned and walked to the perimeter. But 30 meters away behind a stone wall with his optics pointed north, he said something very quiet to himself. 2 words. He would not repeat them later or tell anyone what they were. He had said them. That was sufficient. It was Hatch who found the casing. Post-action site sweep while the medics worked and the extraction timeline was being finalized. He moved through the position methodically because methodical was the only way he knew to move through anything. The casing was on the rooftop of the building to the west, the taller building where Tessa had seen the reflection. He found it in the angle where the parapet met the roof surface in the shadow where it had rolled and stopped. He turned it in his gloved fingers. 300 Winchester Magnum. He crouched there for a moment. 300 Win Mag was not the ammunition of Serbian paramilitary, not of the local security contractors, not of the irregular elements that moved through this part of the world with Soviet-era weapons and older-era grievances. 300 Winchester Magnum was a precision round, a purpose-built round, selected and acquired through channels that required either institutional access or the kind of specific knowledge that comes from institutional training. He looked at the rooftop. Carbon fiber marks on the parapet where a bipod had been set high-end equipment, not sporting goods store inventory. The shooter had settled in with time and preparation. This was not an improvised position. He looked at the footprints leading away. Size 11. Deep tread sole, he recognized the pattern. Salomon Tactical, the 4-season model, widely distributed in the North American outdoor market, less common in southeastern Europe. He stood up. He looked south toward Merritt, toward the woman being loaded onto a stretcher for the walk to the extraction point. He looked at the casing. 4 people had held the full route plan for this mission. Merritt, Tessa, Groff, and the man standing next to Merritt right now, the man in clean civilian clothes with the satellite phone already out his back to the extraction site facing west. Agent Farrow, who was not looking at the woman who had been shot, who was looking at the place on the ground where Merritt had been standing before she stepped out. Hatch stood on the rooftop for a long moment. He put the casing in his jacket pocket. He said nothing to anyone. But he watched Farrow the way you watch something you have placed in a serious category before you have fully named the category, steady, patient, complete. 4 people had the full route plan. The shooter had known exactly where to be. There is a moment in the aftermath of violence when the world rearranges itself. It does not announce the rearrangement. The mountains are still there. The cold is still there. The mission still has a name and a timeline and a set of objectives written in a document somewhere. But the weight distribution has changed. What was background has become foreground. What seems solid has revealed under the pressure of a single event that it was resting on assumptions. The medics worked on Tessa for 40 minutes at the forward aid station, the easternmost container equipped for this purpose, and staffed by Chief Hospital Corpsman Walcott, who had been with SEAL teams for 11 years and had formed opinions about most things. The wound was serious in the complete way that chest wounds are always serious. No partial grades, no qualification, full attention required, and no margin for imprecision. But it was survivable in the way that some chest wounds are survivable, which depends entirely on 2 things: where the round goes and how fast the right hands reach it. The round had gone below the left clavicle above the apex of the lung through approximately 3 centimeters of muscle tissue before stopping against the posterior face of the second rib. It had not touched the lung. It had not touched the subclavian artery, which runs in that neighborhood, and whose involvement would have changed the entire calculation within seconds. It had hit the least catastrophic version of the location it had hit, which was either very good fortune or something more deliberate. That question would matter later. Tessa was conscious through most of the procedure. She did not make this easy on Walcott by being cooperative and quiet. She made it difficult by being cooperative and asking questions, which is a different kind of difficult when you are trying to work in poor light on a patient who wants to understand each step and assess the alternative approaches. Walcott told her at one point to stop talking so he could concentrate. She stopped for approximately 90 seconds. Then she said, "You'll want to irrigate more aggressively than that. Mountain environment soil contamination profile is different from coastal or arid." Walcott looked at her. He had become a patient man through sustained exposure to situations that required it. "I know," he said. "Just making sure," she said. He irrigated more aggressively. She was right. Not in a way that changed his clinical assessment. He had already been planning to irrigate further, but right in a way that refined his assessment of her. There is a difference between someone who knows medical facts and someone who thinks medically, and the gap is not academic. It is the gap between a person who has read about something and a person who has lived inside it long enough for it to become automatic. The instinct had been in the way she phrased the observation, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a statement from someone reporting what they already know to be true. He finished. She rested. The pain was significant, and she acknowledged it with the same clinical distance she applied to everything, categorizing it, determining its information value, noting that its value was limited because she already knew what had happened, and the pain was the body continuing to report a fact she had already received. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She was already running the next walkthrough. Merritt came to see her 2 hours after the procedure. He came alone, which told her something about the conversation before it started. When commanders come alone, they are either bringing information they don't want witnessed or asking for information they don't want witnessed. Sometimes both. He pulled the single chair to the side of the cot and sat with the careful movement of someone whose joints had been filing formal complaints about the last 24 hours. He looked at her face, doing the rapid assessment that experienced people do automatically when they encounter someone who has been damaged, determining how much of the person they knew before is still present and operational. She looked back at him. "Sit rep," she said. He almost smiled. "Almost. You've been out of action for 2 hours, which is why I'm asking." He considered this. Then he gave her one because the worst thing you can do for someone in difficulty is treat them as incapable of receiving accurate information. Dravik had been moved to a secondary location under Hatch's escort and was currently secure. The USB drive, which she had not released even as she went down, he paused here because this detail still occupied a specific location in his attention, was now in his possession, photographed and logged. The two men from the guest house had been observed leaving the village in the Lada at speed approximately 30 seconds after the shot, which placed them outside the engagement and meant they were either uninvolved or had decided the cost of involvement was too high. "And the shooter?" she asked. "Gone. Clean extraction from position." Hatch did a full sight sweep. A pause. "He found the casing." She watched his face. "He'll brief you," Merritt said, "when you're ready." "I'm ready now." A longer pause. "Tessa." He used her first name, which he had not done since before the mission began. "Before Hatch comes in, I need to ask you something directly." "All right." You saw it before Groff called it out. Not a question. The voice of a man who has already answered it and is giving her the opportunity to confirm it aloud, to make it something they have said together, rather than something he is carrying alone. She looked at the ceiling. Corrugated metal insulation panels losing their argument with the cold outside. "There was a reflection," she said. "West roof line, above the 3-story building with the damaged chimney. Less than half a second. The cloud shifted." "You read it as a scope." "The curvature was right. The directionality was right. You were 2 steps from the open." "And you stepped out." "Yes." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "Walk me through the decision." She turned her head and looked at him. His face was doing the thing it did when something had bypassed the professional layer. "If you were out of the picture, there was no one left who could make the call on Dravik," she said. "Hatch and Groff are operators. Briggs is junior. Farrow is—" She paused for a fraction of a second. "Administrative. Dravik had already decided to trust the team based on your presence as the ranking officer. Without you, the extraction falls apart at the human level regardless of what the tactical situation allows. So you stepped out to protect the mission." "I stepped out because the calculations said to." Merritt looked at her for a long moment. Where did you learn to make calculations like that? She looked back at the ceiling. My father, she said. The words sat between them, carrying more than its syllables could reasonably hold. Merritt did not respond immediately. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite recognition, not quite anything else, but the specific expression of a man receiving information that connects to information he already holds and is deciding right now how much of what he holds to place on the table. Hatch will brief you, he said finally. He stood, moved to the door, stopped. For what it's worth, he said, not turning around. In 30 years, I've served alongside 32 corpsmen. Not one of them has ever pulled me out of the line of a round. He went out. The door closed. Tessa looked at the ceiling. She thought 33. Hatch came in 20 minutes later, carrying the specific quiet he wore at all times, not the absence of noise, but the intentional stillness of someone who has learned to move through rooms the way a careful person moves through a conversation present without announcing the presence. He set an evidence bag on the edge of the cot. Inside it, a shell casing. Brass, worn at the base. She looked at it without touching the bag. 300 Winchester Magnum, she said. He nodded. Not local. No, bipod marks on the parapet were carbon fiber composite. Footprints were Salomon Tactical 4-season size 11. North American market. He paused. Someone built that position with preparation. Not improvised, not opportunistic. She was quiet for a moment. How long had the shooter been in position? Compression pattern in the parapet material suggests at least 2 hours, maybe 3. They were there before we entered the village. She let that sit. 2 hours before their arrival. The shooter had not tracked them, had been in position beforehand waiting for the specific moment of exposure, Merritt stepping out from the alley into the open ground. Someone told them where we'd be, she said. Yes. And when? Yes. The generator ran its constant note outside. 4 people had the full route plan, she said. Hatch looked at her steadily. Yes. She did not say the 4th name. He did not say it. They sat with the shared weight of it, and the weight had the quality of something that has been underground for a long time and is coming up into the light, which is not always a comfortable process. There's something else, Hatch said. He produced a folded printout and placed it on the cot beside the evidence bag. A database record reduced in font to fit more on a single page. The name at the top was Raymond Cole, Chief Warrant Officer CW4, United States Marine Corps, 1st Force Reconnaissance Company. She read the entries without allowing her face to change, though the entries were familiar. The way something becomes familiar when you have carried it long enough that you can no longer see it from the outside, can only see it from within. Marksmanship qualification. Expert, all platforms. Special skills, precision, rifle extended, range engagement, wind reading, environmental calculation. Multiple deployments, various theaters, commendations she had not known about because the documentation had been redacted above the family notification level. And at the bottom, KAMWA notation. Afghanistan, March 2011. She looked at it for a moment. You found the connection, she said. Wasn't difficult once I was looking for it. The calluses on your right hand are not from medical instruments. The way you covered the northwest approach without direction. The position you chose for your kit at every rest stop. He paused. And you identified a scope reflection at 400 meters in deteriorating light in under half a second. She said nothing. Your father taught you. Yes. He nodded once slowly with the gravity of a man confirming something he already suspected and finding the confirmation carries exactly the weight he had estimated. Does Merritt know? He knows my father was Force Recon. He knows the rest of the file. Hatch looked at her. Something in his expression shifted not to sentiment, but to recognition. I'm sorry, he said, about your father. She looked at the evidence bag, the brass casing inside it catching the light. Thank you, she said. He stood, moved to the door, stopped. For the record, he said, I saw the way you covered that position at the rest stop, without being directed, without thinking about it. He paused. Your father trained someone exceptional. He went out. She sat with the casing and the printout and the specific weight of what Hatch had not said, which was the same weight she had been carrying since the afternoon she was 16 years old in a bedroom in Richmond, Virginia, opening a box of her mother's papers and finding a manila envelope, and understanding slowly and then all at once that the official account of her father's life and death had large and deliberate gaps in it. She pressed her palm against the blanket. She thought about her father's hands, the angle of the thumb when he was demonstrating a grip, the placement of the trigger finger. Patient, precise. The hands of a man who believed the body could learn anything given time and repetition and honesty about the distance between where you are and where you need to be. She thought about the last time she had held a rifle. She had been 16. 2 weeks before her mother's first hospitalization. The range in North Carolina alone, because by then she went alone. The muscle memory was established enough to be self-correcting. And driving home, she had thought about what it would mean to keep doing this, to keep practicing something that connected only to a life that was now definitionally over. 2 weeks later, her mother went into the hospital for the first time. 3 months later, on an afternoon in November, with the trees outside the hospital window losing their last leaves, her mother had reached out and taken her hand. Promise me. 2 words with a specific weight of words that had been waiting for exactly the right moment. She had promised. She had meant it completely. She had kept it for 11 years. Groff found her sitting up in the cot 4 hours after the procedure, reviewing the topographic map of the area around Brest on a tablet Merritt had left. She was eating from a ration pack with one hand and holding the tablet with the other, looking like a person who had been shot approximately 8 hours ago and had decided this was not sufficient reason to stop working. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up. He came in. He did not sit. He stood at the foot of the cot with his arms at his sides, which was unusual. Groff communicated partly through crossed arms, through the body language of professional reserve, and having them at his sides was the equivalent of another man having his hands open. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. His voice was what it always was, flat, calibrated, dry as an empty magazine. But something underneath it was not what it always was. "For what?" she said. "The needs assessment. You were right. 4 more kilometers on that joint with the compensatory gate, and we'd have been carrying Briggs out. That would have been a mission compromise." She looked at him. "You were also right about the kit. Distributed weight would have been a problem in the contact situation. Response time exactly as you said." He looked at a point above her head, his version of direct eye contact when a conversation was requiring something that did not come naturally. "I made an assessment based on incomplete information," he said, "committed to it before I had sufficient basis. That affected how I deployed an asset for the first 12 hours of this mission." He paused. "That is a professional failure, not a personal one, the kind that has real consequences in the field." She understood this was the apology. The private version, the kind a man gives when he has examined his own conduct and found it inadequate and is honest enough to say so with one witness. "I appreciate that," she said. He nodded, turned to go. "Groff," he stopped. "The casing hatch found," she said. "Does it change your operational picture?" He turned back. His eyes found hers and held. "It changes most of it," he said. She held his gaze. "Then we need to talk about Frankfurt." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled the chair from the corner and sat down in it, and the conversation that followed was the kind that lives in the decisions it produces rather than the words it uses, and neither of them would repeat it verbatim to anyone. They moved Tessa to the operations container the following morning. She could walk, not comfortably and not at the pace she would have chosen, and every step registered a specific complaint from the wound that she acknowledged and categorized and moved past. Walcott made his medical objections clear and specific, and then accepted that they were going to be noted and overridden with the equanimity of a man who has spent 11 years in this exact dynamic and has reached a working peace with his role in it. The team assembled. Merritt stood at the head of the table. The screen now showed a second location, Frankfurt, 230 kilometers northwest, with a marker near the Sachsenhausen district. Farrow stood at the side of the table. His clothes were still clean. Tessa had begun to find this detail disproportionately interesting. "The extraction team is in place," Farrow said. "Dravik is secure. We move the USB to Frankfurt, hand off to the team, and the formal debrief process begins. Our involvement ends there." Merritt looked at the map. "Timeline? 10 hours. The extraction window is fixed, coordinated with transport back to Andrews." Merritt gave a slow nod. "The kind that takes in information without committing to what it is doing with it." Tessa looked at Farrow. She had been doing this at intervals since the previous evening. Not staring, nothing registering as observation, but the calibrated attention of someone collecting data points and arranging them by relevance. She had enough now to have an arrangement. The arrangement was concerning. Farrow had not asked about her condition. Not once in 12 hours had he addressed her directly or inquired about the wound. This was explainable individually, operational focus, professional detachment. Harder to explain collectively alongside the other things she had noticed. He had been on the satellite phone within 4 minutes of the shot. She had been aware of this even from the ground, because situational awareness does not have an off switch. and she had cataloged his position and behavior the same way she cataloged everything automatically continuously. Because her father had told her a long time ago that the moment you decide you have enough information is the moment you stop noticing the information that changes everything. He had been looking at the place where Merritt had been standing. Not at her, at the corner of the wall. The specific geometry of exposed ground where a man stepping out at the wrong angle would have intersected perfectly with a round fired from a rooftop 380 meters to the west. She had watched him watch that place. She had four people with full knowledge of the route. She had a working hypothesis. A working hypothesis was enough to change how you move through the next 10 hours. The briefing ended. The team dispersed to preparation. Tessa stayed at the table ostensibly reviewing the Frankfurt layout, actually watching Pharaoh move to the door and exit, and watching the specific way he positioned himself outside, visible through the narrow window satellite phone already out before he had cleared the threshold. Hatch appeared at her elbow, which was something he did with a disconcerting lack of announcement. "He's made 3 satellite calls since yesterday," Hatch said, his voice below the generator noise. "I've been logging duration and timing." Against what baseline? Against his calls before the mission. Averaged 2 per day under 3 minutes. Since the shot, 3 calls in 14 hours. First one 4 minutes after you went down. 7-minute duration. She looked at the tablet without seeing it. "The USB," she said. "Has anyone run the metadata?" "Merritt has it. No equipment here for full decryption." "Frankfurt will have equipment." "Yes," Hatch said. "Frankfurt is where Pharaoh is coordinating the handoff." The implication did not need to be articulated. They sat with it in the way that good operators sit with implications that are large and not yet fully formed, not forcing them toward premature conclusions, letting them develop at the pace the evidence supports. "I need to be in Frankfurt," she said. "You were shot less than 24 hours ago." "I know when I was shot." He looked at her. "Dravik will talk to me," she said. "He already has. He gave me the drive. If there's a problem with the Frankfurt handoff, if the situation there is not what Pharaoh is representing, having someone Dravik trusts who speaks his language is not a tactical nicety. It is a necessary element." Hatch was quiet. "Help me make the case to Merritt," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the attention of someone doing a final calculation before committing. Then he said, "Give me 20 minutes." Merritt authorized it on the condition that Walcott traveled with the team. Walcott accepted this with the expression of a man who had known it was coming and had already packed his bag. They left for Frankfurt in 2 vehicles moving through mountain roads in gray morning light, the previous night's snow covering the tracks of everything that had come before. Tessa sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle with the Frankfurt layout on the tablet, working through what she knew and what she didn't, the walkthrough running beneath everything else. Merritt drove. He did not interrupt her. They had been driving for an hour when she said without looking up, "When did you serve with my father?" The road curved through the trees. A patch of ice, a brief correction, and the road again. "Afghanistan," Merritt said, 2009. "He was attached to our element for 6 weeks in Kunar province." "What was he like?" A pause, the long kind. "The most patient man I ever watched hold a rifle," he said. "And I've watched a great many men hold rifles." She looked at the tablet. "He talked about you," Merritt said. She went still. "Not much. Your father wasn't a man who said more than he needed to. But one night we were waiting out a weather delay, and he said he had a daughter back home who could shoot better than half the men he'd ever worked with, and that he had never decided how he felt about that." She said nothing. "He meant it as a compliment," Merritt said. "I understood it as one." She closed the cover on the tablet. She looked at the road ahead, the gray ribbon of it disappearing into gray distance under gray sky, and she thought about a man she had not seen for 13 years, and about a morning at a range in North Carolina when she was 9 years old and a large patient pair of hands had settled over hers on the stock of a rifle, and a careful voice had said, "Feel what it wants to do." And she had felt it, the specific weight and intention of a precision instrument, and she had understood for the first time that the thing in her hands had a nature and that working with that nature rather than against it was the beginning of everything. She pressed her hand against the inside of her jacket, against the place where the drive rested against her ribs. Still there, still intact. They reached Frankfurt in the early afternoon. The hotel was near the river, mid-range functional, the kind of property designed to be forgotten, which is the best kind of property for holding something you want forgotten. Beige walls, neutral carpets, institutional lighting that illuminates without illuminating anything of consequence. Exactly what a CIA case officer selects for a holding position. Pharaoh moved through the lobby with the ease of someone who has used similar properties for similar purposes and knows where the exits are without looking for them. He had been on the phone twice during the drive. Brief calls, logistics rather than content. Tessa moved through the lobby and noted the same things he noted and said nothing about having noted them. Dravik was on the second floor, room 214. Two men outside, not uniformed, not conspicuous, seated in the conversation area at the corridor's end, with a specific attentiveness that announces itself only to people who know what they are looking at. Pharaoh stopped at the quarter junction and turned to Merritt. My people will handle the formal transfer. You can wait in the lobby. Merritt looked at him, then at Tessa. Cole goes in to see Dravik first, he said. He knows her. We confirm he's in good condition, and the situation is what you've represented before we proceed. A pause. Pharaoh's face did the nothing it always did. Of course, he said, smooth, without friction. Two without friction, Tessa noted. Genuine flexibility and performed flexibility feel different when you are paying close attention to the gap between what someone says and what their face is doing when they say it. She went to room 214. Dravik opened the door himself. He looked marginally less exhausted than in the village sleep and food, neither taken with much enthusiasm. His pale eyes took her in with the assessment of a man who has survived in difficult places long enough that caution has become constitutive. He let her in. She told him in Serbian what she needed him to understand. Carefully, without rushing. The places where meaning slips through are the places where pace outstrips comprehension, and what she was conveying could not afford to slip. She told him about the casing, the equipment, the timing of the satellite calls, what she believed the situation to be, with the specific caveat that belief was not certainty, and she was describing a working hypothesis rather than a confirmed conclusion. Dravik listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He looked at the drawn curtains. Then he spoke. He spoke for 3 minutes, steady and low, with the cadence of a man who has been waiting to say something and is now saying all of it. The USB drive, he told her, did not contain what Pharaoh had told Merritt it contained. It did not contain a list of compromised assets. It contained transaction records. 15 years of operational transactions, financial transfers, access sales, cover identities, traded for considerations that would not appear in any official ledger. The name appearing most frequently across all 15 years at the center of the network, the way a hub sits at the center of a wheel, was an American name. She did not say it aloud in the room. She did not need to. But there was more. He reached beneath the mattress and produced a folded document, a legal instrument in Serbian and German, with a Bratislava address and a lawyer's signature. Physical copies of the underlying documentation communications meeting logs, signed authorizations, were held by this lawyer in Bratislava under sealed instruction. If Dravik failed to make a scheduled contact call within a 72-hour window, everything would be released directly to the International Criminal Court. She looked at the document, then at him. She understood immediately what he had built. The USB contained the financial architecture of the network encrypted transaction records that proved the structure. The physical documents in Bratislava were the source materials that gave the transactions context and authorship. Neither set was complete without the other. The drive was unprovable without the documents. The documents were unverifiable without the financial records. Pharaoh knew about the drive. He did not know about the documents. He had built it so neither half could be destroyed alone. She thanked Dravik. She told him to lock the door and not open it for anyone other than her or Merritt. She told him to stay away from the window. He nodded. His pale eyes held hers for a moment. He said one more thing. She translated it for herself before she stepped into the corridor. He had spent 6 years collecting this because he had learned in a long career of watching what happens when things go undocumented, that the only thing worse than a truth no one can hear is a truth that was never written down. She stepped into the corridor. She moved toward Merritt. She said 2 words very quietly with the precision of someone who understands that the timeline has compressed to seconds. The 2 men at the end of the corridor were already on their feet. What followed was a containment situation, its own discipline, operating under its own rules, where the primary objective is prevention rather than engagement, and the ideal outcome is stopping something before it requires the tools of last resort. Merritt was very good at containment situations. He was between the 2 men and room 214 before they had covered half the distance, standing there the way he stood in places he had decided to occupy, not aggressively, not demonstratively, but with a completeness of presence that communicated that moving him was a project of a different order of magnitude than it might appear. The standoff lasted 40 seconds. In the 40th second, Groff appeared from the stairwell at the eastern end of the corridor, Hatch from the western, Briggs from the elevator. The two men reassessed the arithmetic. It took 3 seconds. They moved to the elevator and were gone. Tessa stood in the corridor, one hand pressed flat against her chest where the wound was registering its opinions about the last 90 seconds with considerable specificity. She breathed. She noted the pain. She set it aside in the section of her attention reserved for things that were not going to kill her in the next 5 minutes. She found Merritt's eyes. "Frankfurt isn't the end of this," she said. "No," he said. "Pharaoh is still in the lobby." "I know. The drive is the evidence, but it's not the only evidence." She paused. "There is someone who has been collecting for 6 years. He says he's ready to bring it in." Merritt looked at her steadily. "Who is he?" Merritt asked. She held his gaze. "He calls himself Phantom," she said. Something moved behind Merritt's eyes. Not surprised, the specific expression of a man receiving information that connects to something he already holds, completing a circuit he has been waiting to see close. He said nothing. She noticed this. She stored it. There are things that cannot be prepared for. Tessa Cole had prepared for most things before they happened. The walkthrough was the discipline her father had given her, not as armor, but as a way of meeting the world before it arrived, so that when it did arrive, something was already standing at the threshold. She had not walked through this. She had walked through finding his name in records, finding the gaps, finding Merritt. She had walked through the conversations she would eventually have, the questions she would ask, the answers she was ready for, and the ones she was not. She had not walked through the smell of his jacket. You cannot prepare for what the body stores in places language cannot reach. She had stood in that parking structure with her face against the rough fabric and felt with a completeness she had not anticipated that the 13-year-old who had stood at a graveside in Virginia November rain had been wrong. Not wrong to grieve, wrong about the finality, wrong in the way people are wrong when they have been given false information by systems they have been taught to trust. After a while, she stepped back. She looked at his face in the bad light of Sublevel 2 and began for the first time to listen. Raymond Cole was 53 years old. The lines in his face had deepened and multiplied the way they do in a man who has spent years outdoors in hard weather with limited access to softness. His hair had gone from the brown she remembered to gray-white at the temples. He was thinner through the face, heavier through the shoulders, an unexpected combination, until you considered the kind of life that would require strength and deny comfort for 13 consecutive years. His eyes were the same, completely exactly the same. The eyes that carry the thing underneath all the changes. The thing that was there before any of the years accumulated, the original thing that makes a face that face and no other face in the world. She knew those eyes the way she knew her own hands. She asked him to tell her. He told her. He had discovered Pharaoh the way most things are discovered in intelligence work, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small inconsistencies that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. A funding discrepancy in an operational account. A source who knew something he should not have known. A timeline that did not match the official record by a margin too small to report and too large to dismiss. He had brought it through channels. This had been, as he acknowledged looking back on it, a significant error. He had believed channels would function as designed. He had believed this because he was still at that point operating under the assumption that the problems he had identified were peripheral rather than structural. He learned differently within 72 hours of filing his initial report. The learning was specific. A vehicle passing his street in Richmond 3 times in one morning. A colleague who had stopped making eye contact over 2 days of working in the same building. A call from an unknown number that did not speak when he answered. He recognized what was being communicated. He had spent his career communicating the same things to other people. He had 48 hours, possibly fewer. He had called Merritt. He called Merritt because Merritt was the only person in his professional life with whom he had established trust that was not institutional, not based on shared affiliation or clearance level, but on shared experience built in specific places under specific pressure and not replicable under any other conditions. 6 weeks in Kunar province in 2009, several moments of the kind that reveal what a person is made of, and what Raymond Cole and Jack Merritt had learned about each other in those moments had established something that existed independently of any organization either of them served. Merritt had listened. He had asked 3 questions. Then he had said, "There is a way to do this, but it requires you to stop existing." He meant it precisely, not metaphorically. A dead man is not a threat. A dead man cannot testify. A dead man cannot present evidence or file reports or disrupt operational continuity. A dead man is a closed file. The staging had taken 12 days and had required Merritt to spend relationships and access accumulated over 30 years' resources he had not spent on anything else because he had always understood they were finite and that spending them on the wrong thing was a permanent impoverishment. He spent them on this. He spent all of them. Raymond Cole died officially on March 14, 2011 in Kunar province during an operation whose basic parameters were real enough that the documentation supported the account. A notification had been sent to Richmond. A letter. An empty casket. He stopped here. He looked at his daughter and his eyes, which had been steady through the whole account, were doing something different. She had lived the next part. She did not need him to tell her about the letter or the casket or the November afternoon. She had stood at a gravesite in the rain and watched something that contained nothing be lowered into ground that would hold it forever. She looked at him steadily. She had learned steadiness from him, and she thought that perhaps the best way to honor what he had taught her was to use it in the hardest moments, the moments it had been built for. "Why didn't you contact us?" she asked. He gave her both answers. The first was operational. Any contact would have created a traceable signal. Pharaoh was thorough, patient, disciplined in the way of someone who manages threats by waiting for them to surface and then addressing them at the surface rather than chasing them underground. If Raymond Cole had reached his wife or his daughter in any verifiable way, Pharaoh would have known the death was staged and everything built on that staging would have collapsed. The second answer was not operational. He said it quietly in the tone of someone saying something that has been carried for a very long time in a place that language does not reach easily. He said there had been a period in the first years when he had believed he would be done quickly, that the evidence would accumulate faster than it had, that the situation would resolve, and he would be able to come back and repair what the disappearance had cost. He had been wrong about the timeline. Every year it extended, the weight of what it was costing grew heavier. And the weight of going back grew with it because coming back after 1 year is something that can be absorbed, and after 3 years requires explanation, and after 7 or 10 or 13 years, that becomes its own gravity, its own momentum in the direction of continuing because the cost of return had grown to match and then exceed the cost of remaining gone. He paused. He said he had watched her from a distance. He said this carefully aware of what he was acknowledging. He had built operational capacity over 13 years that served two functions, simultaneously gathering evidence against Pharaoh and maintaining awareness of his daughter's location and circumstances. He had known about community college. He had known about her enlistment. He had known about SEAL Team 3. He had known because Merritt had found ways to communicate it through channels that left no traceable record that she was the best corpsman in the element, and that in 6 years of operational support, she had never failed to bring everyone home. He had known she was on this mission. He had positioned himself in this region before the team arrived. He had not known until he heard the shot at 380 meters in a direction that placed it on the west roofline of a building in a village called Bratesht, what had happened. He had understood it in the 3 seconds between hearing the shot and calculating its origin and what it meant. He had made the calls he could make, sent the messages he could send. He had positioned himself in Frankfurt because Frankfurt was where this was going to end. And he had known it was Frankfurt because he had known Pharaoh's logistical pattern for 6 years. The same hotel district, the same extraction coordinator Pharaoh used whenever he needed to move something sensitive out of Eastern Europe. When Phantom's network confirmed that Pharaoh had activated his Frankfurt contact 48 hours before the mission launched, Ray had moved. She listened to all of this. When he finished, she looked at him without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "Mom knew." Not a question. She had suspected it for years in the way daughters suspect things about their mothers that are too large to ask directly, that live in the spaces around certain conversations. The box of papers. The way her mother had spoken about her father, not with the raw grief of sudden loss, but with the specific quiet of someone managing knowledge that cannot be shared. The careful way she had kept certain documents and discarded others. The look on her face on one particular afternoon when Tessa was 15 and had asked something specific about her father's service record, and her mother had answered in a way that addressed the question precisely while leaving something larger deliberately untouched. She knew, he said. She kept it. She kept it for 11 years. Tessa pressed her hand flat against her jacket, against the drive, against the wound beneath it. "She made me promise not to pick up a rifle again," she said. "I know." "Did you know she was going to ask that?" A long pause. "I didn't know the specific thing she would ask. I knew she needed you to be safe." I knew she was afraid that if you kept those skills active, you would eventually use them in a situation where the cost was. He stopped. She was protecting you the only way available to her. Tessa thought about her mother's hands on hers, the texture of the hospital blanket, November light through a hospital window. Promise me. She had promised. She had kept it for 11 years. She had broken it in Romania with a Barrett M82A1 and a round in her chest. And she thought now, looking at her father's face, that perhaps her mother had always known this was where the promise would eventually break, and had asked for it anyway. Not because she believed it would hold forever, but because she needed to believe for the time she had left that it would hold long enough. She would have wanted to know you were alive, she said. Yes, he said. She would have. Those three words in the cold air of the parking structure were sufficient to fill the space completely. They stood with them. Merritt came forward after several minutes, exactly as long as necessary, and not longer, which was his way of managing most things. He stopped in front of Raymond Cole. The two men looked at each other. 13 years since they had been in the same location. 13 years of a specific distance, not cold, not hostile, but weighted with what maintaining it had cost. Cole said Jack. Merritt said Ray. That was all that needed to be said at that particular moment, and both of them understood this because they were men who had learned through long experience to distinguish between what needs saying immediately and what can be carried a little longer. Tessa watched them. She watched Merritt's face specifically. Something had been sitting at the edge of her awareness since she had said Phantom's name in the hotel corridor, and Merritt's eyes had moved in the way that circuits complete rather than open. You knew, she said. Merritt looked at her. When you authorized me for this mission, she said, when you read my file, when Pharaoh brought me in as the Serbian language asset, she paused. You knew who I was. He held her gaze without flinching. Yes, he said. The word landed with weight commensurate to what it contained. How long? Since you enlisted, 2018, your name came across a routine personnel assignment review. I recognized it immediately. You put me in SEAL Team 3 support. I requested the assignment. She thought about 6 years of operational work, the missions, the people she had brought home, the quality of attention Merritt had always paid her work, not protective in any way that would have registered as unusual but thorough. Present. She understood now that it had been doing two things at once. You were watching out for me, she said. I made a promise to your father, he said, in 2011. He asked me for two things. The first was to help him disappear. The second was to make sure that when you enlisted and he was certain you would enlist, you were placed where someone who understood what you carried would be paying attention. She looked at her father. Cole looked at her with the eyes she remembered doing what they were doing. He said you would find your way to the right place, Merritt continued. He said the only thing you needed was someone who wouldn't stand in the way. She turned back to Merritt. You didn't stand in the way, she said. No. In Romania, when Pharaoh brought me in, you knew what Pharaoh was? I suspected what Pharaoh was. Suspicion without confirmation is not actionable. But you knew I was on this mission. You knew my father was in this region. And you let it run. I let it run, he said, because your father had spent 6 years building a case that could only end this one way. Because the USB drive was the critical element. And because he paused. He looked at her with the weight of something carried a long time and now being set down. Because he told me that when you were ready, you would know how to use everything he had taught you. I needed to see if he was right. The silence held. Cole said quietly, he was right. Merritt looked at her. She stood in the bad light of sub-level 2, 5'4" and 122 pounds, with a round's worth of damage working through her chest and 11 years of a kept promise behind her, and her father standing 3 feet away for the first time in 13 years. She felt with a clarity that had nothing sentimental in it that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She said, Pharaoh is upstairs. Yes, Merritt said. He's been on his phone since we came down here. Yes. He'll have a contingency, something already in motion. Yes. Then we need to move, she said. It was not a suggestion. Merritt looked at her for one more second. Then he turned toward the ramp. Tell me on the way up, he said. What Pharaoh had in motion was a secondary team. Ray Cole had known about them because Ray Cole had spent 13 years learning how Pharaoh thought, planned, and structured his contingencies. Pharaoh was a thorough man. He did not run single-thread operations. He understood that the value of a backup lies not in its existence, but in knowing precisely when to activate it, not too early, not too late, at the exact moment the primary course of action has become untenable. The primary course of action had become untenable approximately 40 minutes ago when Merritt's team turned back the two men in the hotel corridor. The secondary team was four people. Former contractors not on any current agency roster operating under a private arrangement that had never been documented because the nature of private arrangements is that they are not documented. They were moving from a staging location in Nordend, approximately 12 minutes from the hotel by vehicle. Ray had known about them because he had been tracking them since they arrived in Frankfurt 2 days prior, because he had known Farrow would need them if the primary approach failed, and he had known the primary approach would fail because he had built it that way. The message to Hatch, the positioning of evidence, the timing of Phantom's introduction into the operational picture had all been constructed with the knowledge that it would push Farrow to his backup option at a specific point in the timeline. He was, Tessa reflected as they came up the ramp, still exactly the man she remembered from the range in North Carolina. Patient, methodical, already 3 steps ahead, and not saying so because he was waiting for you to get there yourself. 12 minutes, Merritt said. Closer to 10 now, Ray said. Merritt processed this. Groff was covering the south exit and the parking entrance. Hatch was on the east stairwell. Briggs was at the vehicle level above. The geometry of the situation had narrowed Farrow's options to one direction. What happened in the next hour happened at the pace that these things always happen, faster than planning and slower than memory, compressed into a sequence that was not dramatic in the moment, but would organize itself into significance afterward when there was time to look at it from the outside. The secondary team hit the hotel from the south approach street level entry exactly as Ray had predicted, based on his surveillance of their reconnaissance the previous day. Groff engaged the containment from the south exit with the efficiency she had expected from him since reading his file. Tessa went to the third floor with Hatch through the east stairwell to room 312, where Dravik had been moved 40 minutes earlier, Hatch having anticipated this need and acted on it without being asked, which was what Hatch did. She explained the situation to Dravik in Serbian. He listened. He told her about the Bratislava documents, the safety mechanism he had built in the lawyer, the 72-hour contact window, the ICC release that would occur automatically without his intervention if he failed to call. Hatch listened to her translation. He built it so neither half could be destroyed alone, she said. The drive is useless without the Bratislava documents for context. The documents are unprovable without the financial records on the drive. Farrow knew about the drive. He never knew about the documents. Hatch looked at Dravik with something close to professional respect. 17 years in state security, Tessa said. He learned from the best and the worst. Oh, Dravik said something else. She listened. He says his next contact window is tomorrow at noon. He has been maintaining it every 72 hours for 6 months. It's a dead man's switch, Hatch said quietly. It has been for 6 months, she said. He built it before he walked into the consulate in Vienna, before he trusted anyone. He built it because he understood that the only position from which you can negotiate safely is the position from which the other side cannot benefit from your removal. Hatch nodded slowly. They waited. She heard the contact at 7 minutes. Movement below the window, disciplined, coordinated, too purposeful for ordinary pedestrian patterns. She was already away from the window before the sound fully registered, not because she thought about moving, but because adequate training writes certain responses below the level of conscious decision. Groff's voice in the earpiece, south entrance, 4 tangos, moving. Then 12 seconds later, Briggs on the east stairwell. I've got one coming up from the lobby level. Staff access door. She looked at Hatch. He was already at the door. She moved to Dravik and positioned herself between him and the window back against the wall. She assessed what she had. The M18 at her hip, her medical kit over her left shoulder where it always was. The wound in her chest which was communicating with her about the last 20 minutes in specific and unflattering terms. She noted this, acknowledged it, and allotted it the portion of her attention it was going to receive, which was not the majority. Then she heard Briggs on the stairwell, not his voice, his boots, the specific cadence of someone moving under physical duress, and then a sound that resolved the ambiguity of that cadence with complete immediacy. A shot, suppressed but not silent. The quality of a round fired in an enclosed concrete space. Then his voice, and his voice was wrong, tight, compressed, working around something that was by my stop space, that breathing needed. I'm hit. East stairwell landing between 2 and 3. Femoral, I need doc. She was at the door before he finished the second sentence. Hatch caught her arm, not roughly, firmly. Corridor is not clear, he said. I know. Tessa. Femoral arteries, she said. 90 seconds before volume loss begins to compromise consciousness. Less if the bleed rate is what I think it is from his voice. The corridor is not the problem I need to solve right now. Hatch looked at her for 1 second. Then he went through the door first and she followed immediately, and they moved at the pace that experienced people move when the geometry of the situation has been assessed and found to allow exactly this much speed and no more. The east stairwell door, she went through. Briggs was on the landing between the second and third floors, back against the railing. Right leg extended, both hands pressed into his inner thigh with the force of someone who knows what has been hit and is doing the only right thing and will not be able to maintain it much longer because the blood coming through his fingers was coming at the rate that told her she had less time than she had estimated in the corridor. She was beside him in 3 steps, her hands on the wound before she had fully lowered herself to the landing, because every second of setup time in ephemeral bleed is measured against a clock that does not accommodate setup. The round had entered the medial thigh approximately 8 centimeters below the inguinal crease. High femoral, the location that gives you the least room to work and the least time to do it. Cat tourniquet from the front pocket, always the front pocket, always the same pocket, because in the moment when a tourniquet is the only thing that matters in the world, you do not search for it. She had it on and cinched in 11 seconds. She wound the windlass. She watched the bleed rate. She wound again. The rate changed. She held the windlass and felt under her hand the specific feedback of sufficient occlusive pressure, and she noted it and held it and looked at Briggs's face, the color of something kept away from light, and she said his name in the tone she used for patients who needed to be anchored to the present moment rather than the one their body was trying to pull them toward. He focused on her. "I've got you," she said. "Stay with me. Look at my face." He looked at her face. "Good," she said. "Stay there." From below the lobby, the south entrance floors beneath the sounds of a security situation being managed by people with the training and numbers to manage it, Merritt's team doing what they were there to do. And from the landing above the door to the third floor corridor, 30 meters from room 312 from Dravik, from everything that needed to remain inaccessible, the door handle moved. She had Briggs's tourniquet windlass in her left hand, locked her left fingers, monitoring the distal pulse below the application point, with the attention of someone tracking two things simultaneously and not allowing either of them to degrade. Her right hand came up with the M18. The door opened 6 inches. She said clearly, "Federal officer, do not enter this stairwell." The door stopped. She held the M18 steady. She kept her left hand on the windlass. She watched the door and watched Briggs's face, and she did not allow either of them to become less than fully present to her attention, because this was the thing, this was the exact thing her father had been teaching her from the beginning. Not how to shoot, not how to close a wound, how to hold two things at once without losing either of them, how to be complete in more than one direction simultaneously. Both hands, not one or the other, both. The door closed, boots on concrete going down, the sound diminishing until it fell below the ventilation noise. She looked at Briggs. "Still with me," he said, more color in his voice than 60 seconds before. "Still with you," she confirmed. She marked the tourniquet time with the marker she always carried, always without exception, because marking tourniquet time is a fundamental clinical step that people skip under stress and that she had not skipped once in 6 years of operational work. She checked the distal pulse. She checked his color. She stayed on the landing until Merritt's voice came through the radio with the contained quality of a commander whose situation has concluded in the manner intended. The secondary team had been detained. Farrow had not moved from the conference room because Ray had been right about his pattern. He never moved personally when he had people moving for him. She got Briggs to the second floor landing with Hatch's help through the door into the corridor, where Walcott was waiting with a second kit and the expression of a man who had assessed the situation from the doorway and had specific opinions about it. She gave him the tourniquet time, bleed rate estimate, the complete picture in 40 seconds clinical shorthand, the language of handoff that carries maximum information in minimum time. Walcott took over. She stood up. She looked at her hands. Both of them, left which had held the windlass, right which had held the M18. She closed them both. She turned toward the stairwell. Merritt was outside the conference room on the ground floor. Groff, Hatch, Ray standing slightly apart from the group in the way of someone still recalibrating to the strangeness of being in a lighted room where people can see him after a long time in the dark. Merritt looked at her as she came down the corridor. He read her face, her hands a set of her shoulders. She nodded once. He opened the conference room door. Farrow was seated at the conference table with his jacket on, his phone on the table in front of him, his hands flat on the surface. Prepared. He had known this moment was coming. He had been sitting with it. He looked at each person entering the room. Merritt, Tessa, Hatch. His face maintained its practiced neutrality. Then he looked at Ray Cole, and the neutrality stopped. Not a reaction. A stoppage, the expression of a system encountering a variable it had specifically excluded from its calculations, a variable it had structured everything around the absence of now standing in the room under fluorescent light. The processing required to incorporate this was taking longer than usual. He said nothing. Ray said nothing. Merritt placed the evidence bag on the table. The USB drive inside it. Beside it, the shell casing from the rooftop in Brest still in its bag. The drive has been imaged, Merritt said. The images are currently at 3 separate secure locations, none of which you have access to, and none of which will become inaccessible by any action you are currently in a position to take. He paused. Dravik has provided supplementary testimony recorded and transmitted. Physical backup documentation will be released to the International Criminal Court by a Bratislava attorney at noon tomorrow, regardless of what happens in this room tonight. Farrell looked at this drive for a long time, then he looked at Ray. How long, he asked. 6 years, Ray said. Farrell absorbed this. He looked at his hands on the table the way you look at something you have used for a long time and are now computing the full account of what they have done. 13 names in the first tier, he said. You'll find all of them in the records. It was not a bargain, not a negotiation. The statement of a man who has worked through the remaining options and found that the one most consistent with his understanding of himself is the one where he does not pretend that what exists does not exist. We'll find them regardless, Merritt said. Yes, Farrow said, but faster with my cooperation. He looked at the table. I didn't start because of money, he said. I want that on the record. He said it not as a plea, but as a statement of fact he was apparently unwilling to omit. I started because I believed there were decisions that needed to be made that the institutional process would never permit. And then at some point it became about money, and I cannot tell you with precision when that transition happened. Merritt looked at him. David Harmon, Merritt said. Ray's cover name from the official record. Farrell looked at his hands. That is the one thing, he said slowly. I did not want to do. Nobody responded. But I did it, he said, and now you'll be accountable for it. Merritt said, not as threat, as fact. Hatch reached into his jacket and placed a second phone on the table. It had been recording since they entered the room. Farrell looked at it. All right, he said. He said it with the tone of someone closing a door that has been open for a very long time. The processing of what happened in that conference room required the rest of the night, and into the following morning, the machinery of a system addressing a significant internal failure, moving slowly and with the grinding care of an institution trying to correct itself without fully acknowledging the depth of what requires correction. Tessa sat through the portions she was needed for. She translated Dravik's formal statement with the precision of someone who understands that every word is now a document, that every word will carry weight in proceedings where weight matters. She gave each word its full meaning without addition or subtraction. She sat with Briggs when Walcott cleared him for limited visitors. He was pale and medicated in the specific mental state that significant blood loss produces afterward, lucid, undefended, the ordinary protections lowered by physical extremity. He looked at her when she came in. You marked the tourniquet, he said. She looked at him. The time, he said, you wrote it on the band. Standard practice? I know. I've had medics before who skipped it, who forgot under pressure, and then you're the second medic inheriting the tourniquet without knowing how long it's been on, and you make the wrong call because you have no information. He looked at the ceiling. You were holding a gun at the same time. Yes, he looked back at her. In his face stripped of the usual protections by what his body had just been through, she could see clearly the thing that had always been underneath the energy and the casual initial certainty, something younger and more genuine, the actual person past the performance. I was wrong about you, he said, from the beginning. Before I had any basis to think anything about you, I decided, and I was wrong. She looked at him. He was 26 years old and he had nearly bled out on a concrete landing, and he was saying this directly and without softening it, and she understood what it cost. You kept me walking, she said. In Romania, the compression on your knee. You didn't argue. He shook his head slightly. That's not. It matters more than you think, she said. Not everyone accepts the help when it's offered. Some people argue. You didn't argue? He was quiet for a moment. Doc, he said. He stopped. Started again. Thank you. The two words covered considerably more ground than they occupied. She nodded. She went out. Groff found her in the hotel corridor at 5 in the morning at the window at the end of the hall, looking east toward the river. The sky was beginning its preliminary consideration of morning, a lightening at the horizon that was not yet color the absence of darkness rather than the presence of light. He came and stood beside her. At the far end of the corridor, 20 meters away, Hatch stood apparently reading something on his phone. Whether he was actually reading was a question Tessa did not need to resolve. Groff saw him too. He did not lower his voice. In Romania, he said, when you covered the northwest approach without being directed. She waited. I saw it, he said. I logged it, and then I didn't act on it. I told myself it was a coincidence. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I chose the simpler explanation because the accurate one required me to revise an assessment I had already committed to. He looked at the river. That is a professional failure, not a personal one. The kind that has consequences in the field. The consequence in this case was that I underdeployed an asset for 12 hours of a mission where 12 hours mattered. He did not lower his voice. Hatch at the far end of the corridor heard every word of it. I sorted you wrong, Groff said, from the start. She looked at the river. You sorted me on incomplete information, she said. I had more information than I used. Yes, but when the information changed, you moved. She turned to look at him. In the stairwell corridor when it mattered, you were there. He met her eyes. That's a generous reading, he said. It's an accurate one, she said. They stood at the window. The river caught the first light and held it briefly, and let it go the way moving water does present for a moment, continuous in its movement. Never the same water twice, but always the same river. Groff said, your father trained you. Yes. He trained you well. She looked at the water. He had good material to work with, she said. Something moved in Groff's expression, small, genuine, the expression of someone who has encountered in a moment they did not expect to encounter it, something that functions like warmth without requiring the performance of it. She almost smiled. She found her father at 6 in the morning in the lobby stairwell, which was where he had chosen to wait because old habits do not disappear simply because circumstances have changed, and the stairwell offered sightlines in 2 directions and a clear route to 3 exits. She sat down on the step beside him. They sat for a while without speaking. Then she asked him the question she had been carrying since sublevel 2. What do you want to do now? He looked at the middle distance, at the concrete wall, at the specific nothing that people look at when they are looking at everything. There's a formal process, he said. Merit has already started it. The reinstatement of a deceased service member is not a simple administrative procedure. I know that, she said. I'm asking what you want. He was quiet. I want a cup of coffee, he said. That is not instant or reconstituted or produced by a machine that I have to operate in the dark, hoping nobody hears it. She looked at him. I want to sit at a table, he said, in a room where nobody is looking for me and I am not looking for anyone and not have to think about the next move for 20 consecutive minutes. She considered this. 20 minutes seems modest, she said. It's been 13 years, he said. I'm starting small. She looked at the concrete wall. There's a place 2 blocks from here, she said. I passed it yesterday. It had lights on at 4 in the morning, which means it opens early. He looked at her. Coffee, she said. Real coffee. Table. Nobody looking for anyone. A pause. 20 minutes, he said. At least 20, she said. They went. 6 months later, the formal process had concluded. It had not been simple. The reinstatement of a service member, officially listed as killed in action, the acknowledgement that the record was wrong, that a man carried on the roles as KYA for 13 years, was sitting in rooms in Washington, giving depositions, required a level of institutional patience that Merritt had warned her about from the beginning. The nature of what Ray had done and why he had done it was the kind of thing institutions acknowledge quietly in the way they acknowledge things that reveal failures they would prefer not to publicize. But reclassified. His record corrected. His service recognized, including the 6 years of unauthorized work that had built the case against Farrow. He had an apartment in Alexandria now, on the river. She had been there twice. Both times the coffee had been real. The last visit 3 weeks earlier, she had found him at the kitchen table with a topographic map spread across it. Old habits, she had thought. He had looked up when she came in and said without preamble that the apartment was fine, but the river reminded him of a flat approach profile and he was considering somewhere with better terrain. She had sat down across from him. She had looked at the map and at his hands on it and at the face that was the same face it had always been underneath all the years. She had thought this is what it looks like when something is returned to you. Not restored, not repaired, returned, which means it arrives changed by where it has been. And you receive it as it is and not as it was, and you find that what it is now is something you can build from. She had said, "How's the coffee?" He had said, "Better than Frankfurt." She had said, "That's a low bar." He had almost smiled. She had come to understand what a full smile looked like on a man who was still learning to use one again. The classroom was not large. 16 people in 4 rows each at a workstation designed for the curriculum, wide enough for both a medical kit and a disassembled rifle with a monitor showing a split-screen medical imaging on one side, ballistic data on the other. The curriculum was called Integrated Combat Medicine. It was the first of its kind in the United States Navy. The woman at the front of the room was 27 years old. She was 5'4" and as of that morning's weigh-in, had recovered to within 2 pounds of her pre-mission weight, which Walcott had noted with professional satisfaction at her last check. The bruising under her left eye from the first weeks of recovery was gone. The dark circles that had taken up residence during the months of procedural processing and testimony, those had faded to the level of something that required close attention to notice. She looked out at the 16 faces in front of her. Briggs was in the front row there as a teaching assistant. He had taken the assignment with the seriousness of someone who understands that what they are doing is more than what it is called. His right knee was at full function. Walcott had confirmed this at the 8-week mark with the particular satisfaction of a man whose clinical work had held. She looked at the other 15 faces, young mostly, one older, a chief hospital corpsman who had requested a transfer into the pilot program specifically to be in it, sitting in the 3rd row with the attentiveness of someone who expects to be useful and intends to do the work of becoming so. She looked at all of them. She thought about what she was about to say and where it had come from, and she thought about a man at a shooting range in North Carolina, and a man in a parking structure in Frankfurt, and a man who had called her 3 nights ago from a number that had been through several layers of verification and had said in the voice she remembered from her childhood that he had extended his 20 minutes of coffee to 30 and was considering making it a daily arrangement. She picked up the marker. She wrote 3 lines on the board behind her. She stepped back. The 16 people in front of her read what she had written. Heal when you can. Fight when you must. Never let go of either hand. She turned around. This is what integrated means, she said. Not that you are 2 things alternating. Not a medic who can shoot or a shooter who can apply a tourniquet. You are one thing complete, capable in both directions, simultaneously, without degradation of either function. She paused. The day will come when someone needs you to hold both at once. When the patient cannot wait for the threat to be resolved and the threat cannot wait for the patient to be stable. That day is the day this program exists for. That is the day I am going to spend the next 16 weeks preparing you for. The room was quiet. She looked at Briggs. He looked back at her. He gave a small, precise nod. She looked at the 16 faces. Open your kits, she said. We start with the hands. She called her aunt that evening, her mother's sister who had taken her in after the funeral and who had never fully understood what her niece did for a living, but who had over the years developed a working peace with not understanding it. The aunt had a house in Richmond with a porch facing west and a habit of sitting on it regardless of weather, and Tessa had called her from that porch many times and from other locations when she was not in Richmond, and the calls always had the same shape, not long, not detailed, but genuine in the way of a relationship between 2 people who cannot fully explain themselves to each other and have chosen to remain connected across the gap. She told her aunt she was well. She told her about the teaching program in the terms available to her, a new assignment, something she was building from the beginning, something she thought might matter in ways that outlasted any single mission. Her aunt said she sounded different. Tessa asked what she meant. Her aunt thought about it in the careful way she thought about things, without rushing with the attention of someone who has spent a long time around grief and has learned that language is imprecise and worth being careful with. She said that Tessa sounded like she had put something down. Tessa stood at the window of her apartment in Virginia Beach, looking at the November sky, the same gray as the mountains in Romania, familiar and unremarkable, and exactly as it should be. She thought about what she had been carrying and for how long and what it had cost to carry it, and she thought about the nature of things that get set down. Setting them down does not mean they were wrong to carry. The carrying was not the problem. Sometimes things need to be carried until the moment they can be set down, and the moment is not yours to choose. It arrives in its own form and asks you to be ready for it. And readiness is the only preparation possible for the things you cannot walk through in advance. She told her aunt she would come to Richmond for Christmas. Her aunt said she would make the thing with the sweet potatoes. She said that would be good. After she hung up, she stood at the window for a while. Below, the neighborhood moved through its late evening patterns. Cars, a dog walking its person, lights coming on in windows. The ordinary inventory of a place where people have arranged their lives into rhythms small and continuous and sustaining. She had arranged less of her life into rhythms than most people her age. She had spent the years since 16 in the sustained forward motion of someone moving towards something without having named what it was, and the naming had not come in any form she had anticipated. She thought about a man at a table in Frankfurt with real coffee extending 20 minutes to 30. She thought about 16 faces in a classroom looking at 3 lines on a whiteboard. She thought about a parking structure in a stairwell, in a stone wall in a mountain village, in a landing between the second and third floors of a hotel, and she thought about what she had carried through each of those places and what she still carried, and what the difference was between the two. On her desk, the briefing folder for the next assignment had been sitting for 3 days, sealed. She had not opened it yet because she had been completing the things that needed completing first in order without skipping steps. She moved to the desk. She opened the folder. She read the location, the parameters, the timeline. She sat with it for a moment the way she sat with most things, not rushing the assessment, not forcing it toward a conclusion before the full picture had formed. Then she looked at her hands, both of them. The right one with its specific calluses, the index finger that moved by reflex toward what it remembered. The left one with the marks of the work it had done the thousands of times it had held something that needed holding. Both hands. She closed the folder. She went to prepare her kit.